Okay, so hi everyone. I hope you all are doing well today. My name is Nicole Parker. I am the Director of U.S. Outreach for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm really excited to be with you all today, and Morgan has informed me about some of your interests. And so this presentation really is just going to kind of walk through the policy memo writing process, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but this is pretty informal. So feel free to stop me, ask questions, just use the raise hand feature or just call out whatever works for you as we go through the slides. And we will have a breakout activity about 45 minutes into the session where you all can kind of work together in your separate groups to really walk through the outlines of these policy memos that you're hoping to write in the new year. So this is just the outline for today's workshop. I'm going to briefly introduce JSPG in case some of you all are unfamiliar with the journal. I'm going to do a short overview of how to communicate with policymakers, an overview of policy memos, then we'll do the activity in our breakout groups, and then we'll come back and wrap up. So I already said this. This is me. This is my Twitter. Follow me. I don't tweet a lot, but sometimes I'm on there. I'm trying to come back. And this is the Twitter for the journal. And we tweet out all of our events there. So please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, although we don't really post on Instagram. So that's kind of a useless follow. So, but yeah, and we also have a YouTube channel, and I'll share all those links with you all during today's session. So about the journal. So JSPG, we're an internationally recognized open access peer-reviewed research publication, and we're also a nonprofit. And so this organization is really managed by and for students. Most of the staff were either still students or were very early on in our careers. It's very focused on policy fellows and early career scholars that have a wide variety of academic and professional backgrounds. But we're definitely more than just a journal. We were established in 2011, and we've had a lot of issues to date, but we also do a lot of work to kind of make sure our authors get their journal pieces out there amongst the public. And we also have a lot of sessions such as these that really help cultivate a community that's excited about writing policy memos or op-eds or white papers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way we're structured is we have an editorial board, and I'll actually plug later on that we are about to open applications for our editorial board once again in the new year. And then we also have a governing board, which we really lean on for a lot of our events, and we lean on their expertise as we have activities like these and our webinars and workshops throughout the year. We have an advisory board, and of course we have the staff, which includes me. So our mission is really to help students and early career scholars like you all really bolster their credentials in writing for science and technology policy. So we understand that all of you are coming from very technical backgrounds, and we want to just provide a platform for you all to kind of get some experience in writing for policy. We really encourage students to engage in all levels of policymaking. And so that's just not at the federal level. I mean, you all obviously are engaging on a local level of government, but we also encourage you to think about engaging in the government processes that are within your own academic institution. There are always policies within every structural organization. There are going to be policies, and there's always a way to engage with that body. And we also serve as an independent, free, and open source forum for debate and discourse. So, we always are having, even after we publish our issues, we typically always have an event to highlight the articles within that issue. And during those events, you'll see a lot of discussion about what the articles were and what some of the recommendations were and how we can carry them forward towards some implementation. So our scope is very wide. Today, we're really going to focus on policy memos, but we publish any type of policy paper you can think of. So we do op-eds, technology assessments, white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, our call to papers, we have 2 call to papers currently open, but the one with the due date on STEM education and workforce is coming up January 23rd is very focused on op-eds and position papers. So those are, depending on which one you do, those are very obviously opinion based and very focused on one position. And so that would be different than a memo in which you would really want to work on presenting both sides of your argument and really help inform the policymaker with your final recommendation. We have a large range of topics. Our special issues tend to focus on a specific theme. Over the summer, we published a theme very focused on climate change. We recently published an issue alongside NSPN that was very focused on intersectionality within science policy. And our upcoming special issue is going to be very focused on STEM education and workforce. So we do have our general issues that accept topics on anything, and we usually have about 2 of those a year. And so these are just a range of the topics. I'm not going to read them, but these are the range of the topics of all the things that we've published over the last few years, last decade. Oh my gosh. I said a few years like it only been 3 or 4. Okay. And so now that I've given you a little information about the policy, about our journal, I am going to take some time really quickly to pull up my chat and make sure I drop all of our information in there on how you can follow us in case you don't already. And there's also a link for you to sign up for our newsletter in that blurb as well. And so now I'm going to move into the meat of the presentation, in which we talk about communicating to policymakers and writing policy memos. So generally in science policy, this is a science policy group, so I know a lot of this information won't be super new for you all, but going to walk through it anyway. Communication on all levels is very, very key. Written communication is very important, obviously, but also verbal communication can be very important. A lot of times, depending on where you are in the policy space, you are conducting meetings like Hill meetings in which you only have a very short amount of time to get your point across. And so it's very important to really understand how to communicate the particular stakeholder you are talking to, what's important to them, right? And making sure that you're tailoring each, however you're communicating, you want to make sure you tailor that to your audience. Because we are intersecting science and policy, we really want to make sure that we're providing some balanced scientific information. And we want to make sure that we're not leaning towards one side, and we really want to make sure that it's very clear to whoever we're speaking to. There can be a lot of jargon in science. And so we just want to make sure that what we're giving whoever we're talking to, we want to make sure whatever information we're giving them can't be misinterpreted in a negative way that goes against what we were providing the information for. We want to make sure it's evidence-based and also like quick summaries. Policy moves very, very fast. And so you want to be able to get your point across extremely quickly in whichever way you're communicating. So in a memo, that could mean making sure it's only 1 to 2 pages. And in a situation in which you're talking to someone verbally, you want to make sure you can sum it up in probably less than 5 minutes, right? And kind of already touched on this, but you want to make sure it's relevant to that audience. You want to make sure that whoever you're talking to, you're putting the needs that would concern them to the top of the list. And make sure that it's a compelling story. And that kind of goes back to getting rid of all the jargony stuff. You want to make sure that it's something that people want to hear and that it can be an exciting story. Okay, so we want to, we already talked about framing it and tailoring it to their needs. An important thing on this side that I want to point out is appealing to the emotional side. And so when we're thinking about policymakers on all levels of government, they're really concerned about their constituents. And so, really understand what are the emotions that appeal to them, what would really benefit the people that they're serving. You want to make sure you're highlighting that in whatever message that you're sharing. You also want to make sure it's aligned with what's going on currently in the political landscape, especially if you're thinking about this on a policy level as far as local, federal, and state. For example, I'll give an example. of what I'm going through right now. So as someone who is a lobbyist for the federal government, our clients have a lot of initiatives that they want to put forward right now. However, if you've watched the news at all, the main thing Congress is concerned about right now is the Build Back Better reconciliation bill, which still has not passed, the debt ceiling, which is probably going to expire December 15th, and the fact, and I'm not even going to say they're supposed to be worried about appropriations, but they've kicked that into February. So that's not even a concern anymore, right? So it would kind of be off for me to come into their office and say, hey, let's talk about fiscal year 2023 appropriations. Like that is like so far down the line, like they are not even thinking about that right now. So you really want to make sure it's timely so it gets the response that you're hoping for. You want the staffers or whoever you're talking to be very responsive. Yes, Morgan, go ahead.
I just really appreciated that example. And I was wondering, how does one stay up with it? How do you know what's time? I mean, obviously, like, the things you're saying, I can kind of tell by the news, like, what's reported on a lot, but like, I wouldn't have necessarily known like appropriations is kicked to February. So like on either a local or state or federal context, like what are the things you do to stay on top of that kind of timing?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, as someone who works in it constantly, it's kind of easy to track it a bit. But I think that if you are, say you're just, as a student, you're just interested in keeping pace with what's going on around you locally. I think a lot of governing bodies, they have hearings, right? Usually their hearings are very tied to what they currently care about. And also tracking legislation that's recently being introduced, right? So you might have, for example, you all are interested in looking into how solar technology can be used in agriculture, right? Have there been any bills recently introduced by the city government that align with that? Who introduced it? That office, obviously, at this time is very interested in that, right? And so just trying to keep a pulse on the issue that you care about by setting up search queries that automatically filter to your email, or signing up for the newsletter of whichever councilman or state delegate that you're interested in tracking, right? And that way you can really understand what's important and relevant to them at the time. But my least favorite way of keeping up with this is cable news, right? Like that's my least favorite way, but it is helpful. In my job in particular, I get a lot of newsletters from like Politico and Punchbowl, and they just kind of really summarize what's going on day to day. And that's also very helpful because in my role in particular, I cover biomedical research issues, which are not always top of mind. And so it's really helpful to get a newsletter that's just digesting everything that's happening, whether it's in like international relations, defense. That way I just have a general landscape of what's at the top of mind, especially when it's not related to my issue area, because sometimes I can block out the things I don't have to work on, but I need to know that they're happening, so I'm just in the know. So that's a really good question. Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you. That was awesome.
And when you do know the right time, I think it's really just important to approach sooner rather than waiting it out, right? So I think as scientists, we want to gather all the data, we want to have all the notes, we want to set the meeting up when we feel like we're really ready. But things do move fast. And so you don't want to miss your window to set up a meeting with someone, right? And talk about your issue. Because if you wait too long, they might have already moved on to the next thing. So just thinking about really, I always say stay ready so you don't have to get ready. But just thinking about that in a regard of just trying to make sure you're really staying on top of things. Another thing is that you want to engage with real world policymaking on current issues. So this just means like being realistic, right? Some things, and this is why it's really important when you're doing your memos to really understand all the factors that play into policy decisions. So, it's not just going to be the scientific evidence that's going to help make the decision. It's also going to be cost. It's also going to be ease of use, workforce, taxes, like there's so many things that can play into it. And so you really have to take all those real world issues. And unfortunately, we also have to think about partisan relationships. Is someone just, not agreeing with an issue because they just don't like the person who introduced it, right? Like, unfortunately, like, these are things you have to think about, because that's just the world that we live in. So that's also another important thing to think about when talking to policymakers. Okay, so key questions, and this kind of goes back to everything that I've said already, but just who's your audience? That's like the most important question when doing this. Who am I writing this for? Who am I talking to? What solutions appeal to them? What problems appeal to them? Just really making sure you really understand that. And I think that's the very first question you always need to answer for yourself before you even get started writing. And then you want to kind of digest on what your message is for this audience. You want it to be extremely meaningful to them or they won't receive it. And you really want to make sure you're including why they should care. And then also the medium. And so how you speak about an issue is going to be different very much so than how you write about it. And so like I said earlier, when you're speaking, you kind of want to think about like, you know, that whole elevator pitch exercise. And so that's going to be really punchy, bottom line up front, not a lot of time for details. So you really want to make sure you hit on the key message in a little bit of time. But if you're writing something, you have a little bit more time to kind of dive into the details and explain your story. And so thinking about what's the best way, you know, when I think about communicating with federal policymakers, a lot of times they're not going to read your memo, right? So sometimes the best way is just to get in front of them if you can. And, you know, every time I have a meeting, I always assume that they did not read what I sent previously. So you just always have to be prepared to do both. And I think, you know, depending on the level of government you're interacting with, that could vary. And so that's just something to keep at the top of mind. Okay, and here's just some basic principles. We kind of talked about this of like avoiding jargon. One thing that I see a lot of is, you know, acronyms that, you know, the general public won't understand, but you understand because that's your discipline. One really good example I heard lately is the way we use the word model. The first thing we might think about is like a scientific model, but in the real world, like they're like a figure, like a model, like a supermodel, right? Like, you know, like you just think about like, and I had never heard an example like that before, but I loved it because it's something that you think isn't jargony, but it kind of is, because if you're not in science, you hear the word model, I'm thinking of make and model of a car, I'm thinking about Tyra Banks, like I'm just not really like thinking about scientific models. So that's just like a thing to think about when you're writing. And you want to use active verbs because you just want it to be punchy, direct, and only include the things that are important. A lot of times we can find a lot of details, a lot of facts that back up our conclusion, but, you know, try to keep it as short as possible and really try to be focused on what's really critical to whatever story you're trying to tell. Keep it true to the facts. Obviously, we want this to be evidence-based. You want to create an outline first, which is something that we're going to start to do today. I always tell people during these workshops, usually in the 30 minutes, you do not have enough time to really finish your outline, but it is a great way just to get started. And you all will have access to these documents following the workshop. So feel free to continue to use them to develop your memos and you know, after this workshop is over. And then also cite your sources. But you all already know that as scientists that you should cite your sources. So I really don't have to like kind of dive into that, but we want to make sure we do that as well. Okay, so writing for non-scientific audiences, you all may have seen something like this before, but you know, writing a technical paper, you've got like your abstract, this long background, your methods, all your experiments and details, and then you tell them the results, and then you like to explain why it matters, and then put the conclusion. And all of that's buried in the discussion at the end of the paper. And nobody is reading all of that stuff in the beginning to get to your results and your recommendation in a paper for a non-scientific audience. So you really have to reverse what you're doing for the public. whatever you want to like call out in your discussion or your conclusion, you have to put that at the top. Bottom line up front is what people always say, and why. And so what I think a lot of in our scientific papers, we put a lot of that so what in the discussion section, and we really need to like pull that out and put that closer to the top so people can understand why this is important before they get into the meat of the details. And kind of once you really help the person understand what your recommendation is and why it matters, then you can kind of get into the all the details you pulled from like city records or transportation data or, whatever you're pulling your data from, then you can kind of put all that in there and kind of explain why your recommendation is the right one after you kind of put that at the top. Okay, so now we're going to kind of walk through just policy memos. And so, policy memos. So who writes them? Usually staffers write policy memos a lot, so policy advisors, also people who are advocating for a particular issue, they often write memos to share. You'll often see people writing memos and to push their certain issue and leaving them with a lot of members of Congress or city councilmen, state delegates, things of that nature, just to push forward their issue because memos tend to be short and straight to the point. And so they're easier to kind of pass out versus a white paper, which may be much longer and have way too many details. And so it's just like anyone can write them, but I would say when you're thinking of someone who does it in their day-to-day job, it's more so like a policy advisor that would usually do that. Obviously, their purpose is really to inform and guide a decision maker. And so usually the audience is always someone who is in that role. In this case, we would probably think of like a city councilman or someone who's working within the office of the mayor. Therefore, people, I love this, uninformed but intelligent. So like you want to make sure, and that's why it's so important to not include the jargon because these people are very intelligent, but they probably don't know a lot about what your particular issue is, right? And so you have to think about the fact that a lot of policymakers are covering a lot of issues, and there's no way they can really go really deep into one of them. And so you have to really go deep for them and kind of pull out the details that they need to understand the problem. So they'll probably have a general knowledge of whatever issue that you're presenting them, but they won't really know enough to make an informed decision. And what we want them to do is have enough evidence to make that informed decision. You want to remember to be brief and be objective in whatever you're writing. You don't want to seem like you're providing a recommendation just because you feel a certain type of way about something. You really want to make sure it's based on some facts. And it's really helpful to think about all the different perspectives that can play into your recommendation and assessing the strengths or the weaknesses of all the different policy options that could present itself to your issue. So these are the principles of memo writing. We went through these already, really, but knowing your audience, who's taking the action, and this can even, and I'll give a detailed example here. A lot of times in my role, we know our audience, we know that it's Congress, but even to a deeper detail than that, particular issues go to particular members of Congress, right? So I am not going to go to someone who is on energy and commerce to talk about appropriation money, like funding for an agency. Like it's not their job to fund, it's their job to kind of authorize things and push legislation through that way. So you just have to really understand who you're talking to and what angle they're going to care about based on what action they can take. And so it's really helpful to know exactly what their role is and know exactly what type of policy levers they can pull in their position. And also knowing who you are. It's really important to tell your story. Often it's very easy to get a meeting and really explain your story as a constituent. As a constituent, they really care about what you have to say because you're someone who could vote for them, and you're someone who could easily influence the people around you that also probably vote for them, right? So, a lot of times that has a lot of weight. But if you aren't in their constituency, if you're connected to a group of people that has a lot of members within their constituency, they could also care about that. So just making sure you're really explaining who you are, so they can, this sounds a little bit rude. You want to explain who you are so they care about talking to you, right? Like you have to kind of put up front like why they should even speak to you. And then also the timing. So current, like, I said this earlier, like right now is a terrible time to bring up anything in Congress because they're just so inundated with so many different things. But understanding the current political climate and the collective social consciousness. And so, for example, a lot of climate issues were really top of mind recently because we just had COP26. And so it was very relevant to bring up those issues. And also there were a lot of there's a lot of climate legislation within the Build Back Better bill. So it was just a good time to kind of talk about those things. And in this particular administration, obviously that fits the political climate. And so it's really important to assess timing in that way. And so this is the, main takeaway. This is the actual dimensions of your memo. So you'll put your main takeaway at the top. You'll have your background and your significance. So this is the why. You want to put your arguments here. And within your arguments, you really want to understand all of these questions, right? You need to make sure you know if there's prior legislation connected to whatever you're talking about. If you do know that funding can be allocated for, like, if your recommendation includes funding something, you need to know how that funding could be allocated. What's the mechanism that can be used to pay for this? Do you have a number? Is there a budget number that you can suggest? Because these are the type of questions a lawmaker would have when they're considering your recommendation. And so you want to be prepared to kind of provide all those answers so they can really weigh all the different factors. And also, what is the political context? Like, will this help them get reelected? Is there a benefit, right, to them doing this? Because there's a lot to play into when they're making decisions. And so all of that needs to go within your argument section, which is really the bulk of the paper, but probably will get read the least because it's the longer portion, right? So, and then having your clear recommendation at the end of the paper is really effective. And so we kind of talked about the structure, but now I'm going to go section by section, starting with the executive summary of like some key elements of what we should have in each section, right? In the executive summary, the background, options analysis, and your final recommendation. So this is one of the papers that was actually in our NSPN intersectionality issue. And so this was kind of very focused on green gentrification, and they were talking about structuring new bike paths in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I thought it was good because it kind of connects to some of the transportation issues that you all care about. And so here, this is the executive summary. And in the executive summary, they really put at the top why you should care and what the policy recommendation is. So this is your abstract, right? And so, this is kind of the issue as far as like you want to help decrease CO2 emissions, you want to promote community help with bike paths, right? Like these are some of the benefits of why you should care about doing this, why it would improve the community. But then also understanding like this can really displace the vulnerable communities that are in these areas, right? And so it's kind of like talking on both sides of the coin. It's like you want them to understand like, yeah, like, okay, I get it. You want to push this because, it's going to be really helpful for all these things, but you also have to understand when you're planning it, it can have this type of impact. And so that really helps them understand, like, I thought about this from all angles, like, and so you want to make sure that they understand that. And then also in the executive summary, they put their recommendation. And so you kind of want to make sure in your executive summary that if they only read this, they get your point. Like they can walk away and say, all right, I got it. I don't need to read the rest. But if they are very intrigued, they will read the rest and they can get answers to some of their other questions. Another thing is the background. So I know like everything is highlighted here, but I think it's a good example to show how you really have to cut the text that doesn't matter. When you are doing your background, you really want to make sure every word matters and that you're not adding a lot of additional text that's not needed. And so here you're kind of just expanding on the issue and expanding on why they should care. So, we put a couple of things up front in the executive summary, but you really want to dive in. And diving in can look like some of the data that you might have of examples of how green gentrification has impacted communities, vulnerable communities, right? So here they kind of highlighted an example in Chicago that really kind of resulted into higher property value and displacing a lot of residents, right? So really pulling out those detailed examples, because this is the evidence that you're going to use for your policy recommendation. And this is really what's going to help them understand how detrimental it could be if they don't take these types of things into consideration. The next part is kind of the meat of the memo. And so thinking about, okay, so you did your background, you did your executive summary, but now you want to provide some policy options, because if you're going to recommend that they really take some time, so this is actually a different topic. This one more so is about installing, this is kind of tackling a climate change issue and thinking about increased heat in vulnerable communities. So thinking about, oftentimes certain communities that have less trees or less coverage have extreme heat. And so a lot of that extreme heat you can see is found in urban areas and areas of vulnerable communities. So this paper is also in that issue, but it's very focused on that, just to give you some background on that. But this paper really did a good job of kind of providing different options and also breaking down the advantages and disadvantages of each option. And so I thought that was really cool and really a good example to share with you all today. So for this particular issue, they provided 3 options actually, which is 1, to install green roofs to kind of help absorb some of the CO2, and then also kind of help with, some shading and things of that nature. Paint the roofs white, which is a simpler recommendation, but also reflects the sun and can result into some cooler temperatures for those neighborhoods. And also just the option of doing nothing at all and what that could cause, right? And so in this paper, they really laid out each option, and they laid out the advantages and disadvantages of each, which is really good for someone who really cares about the issue, really wants to see all the different ways they could probably attack it. And then finally, this is also the pros and cons. I forgot to advance, but they listed the pros and cons, and that's kind of the advantages and disadvantages portion. And finally, they provided the recommendations. So at the end of this paper in particular, they recommended implementing the green roofs. And that was based on a lot of analysis and based on all the research that they had done. They felt like that was the most feasible option. But they still had additional options in saying, like in this recommendation, you can see if the cost of green roofs is too high, you can still use white roofs because that would still provide some similar cooling benefits, right? So it's like, we know cost is a thing. And so they're still providing additional options. And so I think that's really important to think about, especially when you are dealing with city and local government. Cost is always going to be a major factor. And so I thought it was really helpful that this memo in particular, kind of provided 2 options instead of just 1. So that is a walkthrough of kind of the background, how to talk to policymakers, and the memo portion. I'm going to pause because I want you all to take some time to answer any questions you have. And then once we answer questions, if you have any, I'm going to give you all probably about 30 to 35 minutes. I usually give people more than 30 minutes because it's never enough time to kind of go through the questions that were provided. I think I sent you all a notification that you all have access to these documents to kind of write your memo outlines. And then after you take the time to answer those questions in the document, we'll come back together and we'll kind of do a report out and talk them through together. So does anyone have any questions before we do the breakouts? No? Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So we're gonna take the last 15 minutes kind of just to walk through your outlines. And so I'll have the public transit group go first. Is there anyone who kind of wants to walk through your line of thinking and some of the things you placed in your outline on behalf of the group?
I guess I can start, and then Julian and Bethany, please jump in whenever I've missed something.
And I can share the screen
that would be
so you can have your outline up. Okay. Which screen is this? Okay. So many. All right. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, so our group is addressing transportation, and also, not just around the University of Notre Dame, but also throughout South Bend, Mishawaka, and the surrounding areas. And so when we're thinking about the problem to be addressed, one of South Bend's goals in the climate action plan is the large goal is to reduce emissions. And one of the specific ways that they laid out doing this was by reducing trips made by single occupancy vehicles. And just for context, in South Bend, we have a bus system that runs Monday through Saturday, not on Sundays. On weekends, it only goes once every hour. And after like 6 p.m., it only runs once every hour. So we don't have a very strong public transport system at all. And when we're thinking about the stakeholders involved, we listed 4, but there would definitely be more, especially as we got brainstorming. The Office of Sustainability, who are super interested in reducing emissions. We're thinking the mayor, obviously he's ultimately the one making these decisions. The existing South Bend Transportation Group, which is comprised of a 9-member board, and then also just the South Bend citizens, because obviously some taxpayer money would be needed to fund this whole thing, and they're the ones who we're hoping to serve with this. We didn't really know quite who to put for the stakeholder who needs to act on this, because it would be, it's a huge undertaking. We know it's a bit of a pipe dream, but it is nice to think about. We wrote the mayor, though, because we think ultimately he'd have the stamp of approval, like yes, no on if this happens, but we may have interpreted this question wrong.
Yeah, and I think one thing that could be helpful to help answer that question is maybe looking at previous examples of legislation that's influenced public transportation before, because, for example, I think in Baltimore City, which I lived there for a long time, actually the city council president has a lot of weight. Obviously, the mayor is like the stamp of approval, but when you think about it, the president of the city council has a lot of power over what legislation the council discusses. So sometimes that is a person of contact, but of course, every local government is very different from place to place. So it's definitely something you have to look into for your particular area.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's good feedback. We definitely need to look into it. And then in terms of the current landscape in South Bend, the climate action plan was enacted 2 years ago, and they specifically note wanting to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. So there is an interest there. We've had a new mayor since then, but based on his South Bend city plan, he did seem interested in reducing the cost of transportation, especially for low-income residents. And he's open to creative solutions to transportation. He specifically noted public-private partnerships in order to increase transportation. So the two options that we've thought about, one is like our ultimate, this would be amazing if South Bend had a light rail system. And then our more realistic option would be just electrifying the current fleet of vehicles to reduce emissions. And we chose to focus specifically on the light rail system. Again, it's just a little more inspiring. And one reason for this is that by electrifying the current fleet of buses, that will reduce emissions, but we think that having a light rail system could tackle other problems at the same time, like most notably decreasing single occupancy vehicle trips. So when we've looked into the literature before, it talked a lot about how in order to make people who are accustomed to driving their cars take public transportation has to be a more attractive option. It has to be faster, or there has to be some aspect that's more attractive. Like, for example, sometimes if there's no parking, people are more willing to take public transport. And so the reason we're in favor of light rail is because it is faster than buses, and most of the time has right of way in traffic situations. Again, we're thinking like above ground rail system, not an entire subway system for South Bend, but they have the right of way at intersections. And we didn't get all the way through this, but we're just thinking that there would be perhaps better connectedness throughout South Bend with a rail system than the current bus system that only has one hub. So if you have to change buses, it's really a huge problem. And then in terms of implementing the solution, so there's some money that's made it to the city that's been allocated for sustainability initiatives. And a lot of times also in the literature, they cite public-private partnerships to fund these massive infrastructure changes, like light rail will be a massive cost. But we were thinking Notre Dame would be a potential partner in this, along with the cities of South Bend and the city of Mishawaka, just because we were going to go onto the Notre Dame website and find something, but Notre Dame does try to emphasize like community engagement within South Bend. And so if they want their students to be engaged in South Bend, getting into South Bend is important for that. Yeah, and then just in terms of how this advances our cause, it's both environmentally and sustainably like beneficial, like that's our main cause. And then we also were thinking that hopefully this would make it more accessible for low-income citizens, just if we had an expanded system that helps people get around the area better. Again, just access to geographically different parts of South Bend, making it more attractive, more time effective, like people don't take the bus now because it takes forever. So hopefully light rail would be more attractive. And we also think it's in line with what the mayor has said about his infrastructure goals, and it would benefit other communities around us as well. I think the major hurdle we need to tackle is where the $1 billion comes from. And that's in the works.
Yeah, that's usually the big thing. One thing that I'll mention, another thing to consider is looking into the recent infrastructure bill that just passed in the federal government, because that bill does have dollars that will be allocated to states and local governments for infrastructure needs. So depending on the details of what's in that legislation, some of that money may be directed to South Bend. And so thinking of ways that this can be, this is something that they should think about to use those dollars for. Whether it's enough dollars for a whole light rail system, that's another story. because there's going to be a lot of engineering and urban planning that goes into that process. And so it's not a short one. But I really do like a lot of the things that you considered, because one thing that we have learned is that social and behavioral implications are very important when we're making these decisions. It doesn't make sense to electrify buses if they're still not going to use them. That's just a waste of money, right? And I think understanding people's behaviors is a very important aspect of this memo, and it'll be important to highlight that portion when you're making your case for the light rail system. But overall, I think this is a great starting point, and it sounds like you all have thought a lot about the issues and your policy options and why you've chosen one recommendation over the other. Oh, and there's something in the chat. Oh, yes. Oh, I think, sorry, I didn't see your chat. Oh, okay, you just put that in there. I wasn't sure if you had already put that in there before I had said something.
So just building off of what you had said in terms of like specific, even if South Bend isn't getting certain monies, I was reading the other day about what our percentages will set aside to make sure that the infrastructure bill is addressing like historical inequities. And I feel with South Bend and some of the like, I guess problems we've had over time with like a lot of our major industries going away, we do have concerns about transportation in certain areas of our city. So.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. No, that's a really, really good point. Equity is extremely important in this administration, so that's going to be emphasized in almost every bill that passes. Okay, so we got a few minutes left, so I'm going to switch over to the solar group. And so, who would like to represent that group?
Do you want me to go ahead for it, Audrey? So we were like working a bunch at the bottom of our document, and so it's not super organized well.
Oh, that's okay. Is it helpful to share the screen, or do you?
No, yeah, sure, that's totally fine. So okay. A lot of our conversations at the beginning was just really making sure, like, you know, like further narrowing down into the problem space and trying to figure out what is it exactly that we're trying to do with like this policy memo. And I do think the problem we're trying to address here is the fact that Indiana has this untapped potential to address these deficits in our state energy needs, because a lot of coal plants are shutting down with the use of solar and agrivoltaics, but that potential is untapped. We're not taking advantage of all of the, I think, bounty that Indiana has. And so really building a lot of this off of the Mammoth project that happened in Northwest Indiana. It's going to be like the largest solar project in the United States. And so like seeing that incredible like timely relevance of like solar in Indiana, and especially on agricultural land. So trying to say like, how do we build off that momentum, right? Because it's going to be, you know, there was this article I was talking about the jobs, the money that it's going to bring those counties in tax revenue, being able to preserve family farms for generations, because like when you don't have that same like monetary, like fiscal feasibility with just like your crops, being able to like farm the sun, which is what they said, was something that was encouraged. It's something that is more attractive than like wind energy per se. That was one of the things they talked about. And so trying to say, okay, how can we make more of that happening? So briefly, well, yeah, the stakeholders would be the farmers. The big thing in Indiana is these investor-owned utilities, which can be kind of a barrier to some of this kind of thing in terms of selling your energy back to the grid. Potential solar companies. So with the Mammoth project, it was this Israeli-based company that actually is like doing the construction, but then as well as city, county, and state government, legislature, as well as maybe executive agencies. So what we kind of push down to in terms of our policy options, one thought is just trying to make it aware, like, you know, that there is a lot of land in Indiana that could work for this kind of agrivoltaic, so like solar energy being developed on agricultural land, whether or not that's just like getting rid of the farming and like replacing with solar, or current options that are able to like install solar with certain crops and allow them to like cohabitate in a way, as well as recent research coming out of Indiana on like raised solar that allows you to like not even have those same concerns about the crops. So there's all this positive energy there. So just trying to like identify those locations and like just first of all show that this is something that's good, but we realized that might be better off of like us trying to do that as research for the background. And we were really interested because there is some statewide legislation that's actually trying to counter some of these county-wide policies against wind and solar projects to say, could South Bend, the city council, propose a resolution? And so I copied the text here from a resolution that they had done in a very recent city council meeting, essentially just encouraging the state to take action on legislation. So in recent times, they did this to promote the passage of a bill that would allow for driver cards for individuals who are undocumented. So something like that, saying, okay, we encourage the state to take action on legislation that would allow for the development of solar projects in counties statewide, providing that statewide guidance rather than how it's currently being thrown back to local counties. And there's a lot of opposition. So essentially taking this momentum, showing all the positives that this Mammoth project is going to have, and using that to help encourage passage of policy at the state level through the use of these city resolutions. And then the other thought was looking at tax incentives for having these investor-owned utilities to allow for that net metering, to allow them to sell energy back to the grid. So I think the resolution is something that we're really excited about. We're also still doing just like a lot more research into, like, you know, one of the recent articles we're reading about the statewide legislation was from March. So like, where is it now? But this is kind of the avenue that we're thinking of. And yeah, we have like all of our notes at the bottom, but that's kind of where we're at. It was a lot of like brainstorming of like trying to bring it down. And Audrey, if you want to add anything, I was kind of rambly on my part, but I think that's.
Yeah, I think it was just that I think the biggest thing was just feeling like we needed to narrow down, or it kind of felt like it could be multiple problems that we're talking about and trying to address, and just how to narrow that down and kind of be a little bit more focused. I think is like at this point, our biggest thing is there's just so many different avenues we feel like we could go, and just choosing one and trying to like be focused. I think we got too excited. We're like, oh, these are all these things you can do. And then, but it's a little bit too much in some places. So yeah, I think that was the biggest thing.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Like, I think that's what we want the outlines to stimulate. We want us to stimulate conversation. We want you to start to think and dive deep into the issue, because it's really important that policy memos are very focused, right? You can't really be all over the place, and you have to really be clear on what problem you're trying to address and what outcome you want to see. Because if there's just too many things in one, they're going to be like, we can't do this. This is too large. This isn't focused enough, or I care about this issue, but I don't care about this one, right? And so like all great points, all great ideas to kind of go back and look deeper into what's currently on the books as far as state legislation and what's being done. Always great to understand the opposition, because that's, you know, what you really have to counter when you're making your arguments. And so I think this is great. And at this time, you know, if any of you have any questions, feel free to just ask. But I really hope that this was helpful for you and kind of got the wheels turning so you can be successful and kind of write your memos in the coming year.
Yeah, thank you. I found a very helpful exercise.
Great.
I don't have a question, but I'm just feeling very inspired now. So
oh, good.
More good.
Well, we are very happy that you all are feeling inspired and glad that we could help. And, you know, of course, you know, Morgan, you have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. At JSPG, we're always willing to kind of provide any assistance where we can. Of course, I want to plug, you know, please go to our website. We currently have an open call for associate editors, and we also have some issues that are coming out in which we have some submission deadlines for. So if you're interested in STEM education and workforce, or you're interested in science diplomacy, we've got some really cool special issues coming out soon that are very focused on that. So with that, I will let you all go, and happy holidays. That time of the year where we always say that at the end of a conversation. And so, you know, please, you know, you probably all, if you're in classes, you probably have finals. If you do, good luck. But yeah, have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for your time.